Good day, everyone. So we spoke about a discussion section a few weeks ago, I think. So I felt I need to also expand on that and talk about the common scientific writing errors that we get to normally see when we review people's work, the write-up on the discussion session specifically. So we're gonna dissect this discussion section first. When we're done with it, we can move on to other sections like we'll see what other questions do you have. We did say that the way we're writing our discussion section, we first remind the reader of our results. The first paragraph of your discussion section is when you're reminding the reader of your results. By the way, you're not taking each and every result that you had conducted. You're going to pick and choose only the key findings. Remember, this must be aligned to your aims and objectives. So you're going to answer aims and objectives with these results. Remember, you had done all your results, they're comprehensive, right? So you're going to pick only the key findings that are interesting and they are talking to or answering your aims and objectives. So those key findings, you put them in one paragraph in an interpretation format. So when you're writing the results section, it's all numbers, right? But now when you're writing your discussion section, you give us the interpretation of what were the meaning of these results. You no longer write your results in numbers because it's a repetition now of your results section. Again, discussion is interpretation of your results. You're not going to put numbers again. You're only writing the interpretation. That's the first paragraph. You put them all in one as you are reminding the reader of these key findings that you have found in your study. Then the subsequent paragraphs from there, you pick each of these key findings that you had just reminded us according to your objectives, right? You take each of them, you discuss them thoroughly and in depth. So you do this by obviously going to remind us or tell us the interpretation of your findings, then going to compare and contrast with existing literature. Studies that had a similar research question as yours, studies that were conducted with a similar same methodology as yours, and all of that, they looked at what you were looking at. So you're going to tell us to compare and contrast from those literature. And the very end of that particular paragraph, it's very important for you to tell us now the plausible reason of your findings. What might be the reason you have found what you have found? Remember this is in context because you just told us the studies that are in agreement with what you did and those that are they found opposite results from what you have found. So now you're telling us then what in terms of that particular key finding. So you need to be clear on the plausible reason. What could be the reason you found what you have found, and probably the implications to public health. Then you go on to another paragraph. You take the second key finding. So you just need to be clear on this to say the discussion section, it's divided as per your key findings. Don't mix everything in one paragraph. We said the first paragraph, it's all the key findings together in an interpretation format. Then the following paragraph or subsequent paragraphs, we're going to take each of these key findings, we discuss them in comparison with literature. We compare and contrast in comparison with literature. And then we conclude each of these paragraphs with plausible reason for our findings. What could be the reason behind our findings? Then the second last paragraph of our results discussion section, we did say it's us writing the strengths and limitation. And most people really would go on to write about limitation. They don't put on strengths. So please do include the strengths. Then you're going to write your conclusion, which includes recommendations. That is the flow of the discussion section. So now I want us to quickly look, I've noted them down, the common errors that I personally get to see in our book that I always recommend, the quantitative writing book that also speak about. So discussion section, if it's written, then there's somehow subheadings. Discussion, it's a scientific writing error. We cannot have subheadings in a discussion section. It shouldn't. As we read your work, it must have that logical flow. We need to understand what we're talking about, and there must just be that clear flow of ideas and key findings discussed from one paragraph to the next. You are not supposed to have subheadings on a discussion section. Otherwise, it is a scientific writing error. Then presenting new data as well. Sometimes you did not even have this thing that you're talking about now on your results. You didn't present these particular findings on your results, but now it pops on your discussion. we start telling us about it and discussing it. It is a scientific writing error. You are not supposed to present any new data at all on your discussion. We did say we are breaking down the first paragraph, which is the overall key findings. Then we break them down in discussion, right? So you are not allowed to bring something new that was not presented in your results section. Another thing is the listing of this interpretation or the findings, your findings, without defending them. You cannot just list them. So we found this high, we found this low, we found this prevalence, and just leave it there. You can't do that. You remember, you need to compare and contrast with other literature. Most importantly, you need to tell us what could be the plausible reason behind your findings. So that is key. Please do not forget that. You need to clearly defend what you have found. And another thing, you cannot use the words like increase or decrease without giving us reference. In this case, we said in discussion, we cannot see numbers at all, not unless you are comparing your results compared to other literature, other studies. When you're doing the comparison and contrast, you can include then the numbers. But if you're talking to your own results that you have found, you only talk to the interpretation. So when other studies have found something that is increased compared to what you have found or decreased, you cannot just use those weights without giving us the time trends. So you need to make sure that when comparing with other literature, you make sure that you actually include the reference to the estimates. So the generic conclusions as well, before we go to conclusions, the strength and limitation, people go on to label the limitation. They don't discuss them. They'll just say there was selection bias because we selected at XYZ. Then there was probably recall bias because the people, when we collected the data, they might have, or the event had long passed and all of that. You cannot just label the limitation. You need to discuss them. What do you mean by that? And why should we not lose faith in your study if you had such limitations? Do you understand? So you need to not just label them, but you need to make sure that you explain what do they mean, and interpretation, and most importantly, what did you do to try and account for that? That's why we do emphasize to say the strengths has to also be magnified, because they will just come in play as well to try and give us justification on why shouldn't we lose faith in your results, why should we even trust them, why is it worth publications. So you cannot just list limitation. You need to explain limitation, and you need to go on to explain their implications and how did you try to account for that, which you will be able to do that as you bring forth your strengths. Now going to the conclusion. So the conclusion, most people write conclusion very generic. So you know that you conducted a study, for instance, measles in a certain district in Limpopo in South Africa. Then you start telling us about the overall global vaccine state of affairs or conclusions or recommendations. You can't do that because your study was not global. Your study was in a certain district in Limpopo, for instance. So you are not allowed to conclude on anything you did not find in your study. So as we said, with your discussion, you're following the results, same as your conclusion and recommendation. They must be supported by your results. So you need to understand that you only talk to your results, not general knowledge that is already known, that is already there. It doesn't matter how much factual it is. You need to always speak to what you have found. It must be supported by your results. So you're not allowed to do these generic conclusions and recommendations. Also, with the recommendations, you cannot just say children must be vaccinated or catch-up vaccination are recommended. Are recommended by who? Who must do it? Which children? You need to be specific so that when people are reading your write up, or when you get to present it, whoever that you're presenting, it must be clear on who has to take that particular action, by when, how. You need to be specific on your recommendation, so that it is a recipe, right? It must be clear on who has to do what, when, how. So your recommendation must just be precise and specific like that. Another thing on recommendation is really to not give on conclusion. Remember, we give the overall on each of those key findings. We're discussing the plausible reasons, right? And probably the implications of our key findings in each of those paragraphs. Now on conclusion, we are concluding on the overall study, answering our aim now, and we need to give a clear implications of our study. Then what? We don't just conduct study for the fun of it, for the sake of conducting it, we need to answer the then what, and that must be clear on your conclusion. Most importantly, I'm running out of time. Okay, you must give also the direction of further research. Where else, like which direction